Good afternoon and welcome to the Hops 101 webinar brought to you by the University of Kentucky Center for Crop Diversification and the UK Department of Horticulture. I'm Christy Cassidy, an Extension Specialist with the Center for Crop Diversification. Our speaker today will be Dr. Sean Wright, Horticulture Specialist at the University of Kentucky, who will be sharing basic hops production information. Sean has been conducting research on hops since 2011. A copy of today's presentation is available for download in the Files pod at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You will also find a resource list in the Files pod that's available for download. It includes links to websites and documents that Sean will be referring to in his presentation. We will be recording the webinar and it will be posted on the Center for Crop Diversification website as soon as possible. Just visit our website at www.uky.edu/ag/ccd and click on the webinars link in the black menu bar across the top of the page. We will also provide links on our website to the resources you see in the Files pod. To ask questions during the presentation, please type your questions into the chat box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Miranda Combs from the Center for Crop Diversification will help answer questions throughout the presentation. We'll have time after the presentation for Sean to address as many of your questions as possible. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a survey link for you to provide us with feedback. The survey can be completed in a few minutes and will help us plan future programming. With that, I'll turn it over to Sean to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Christy. I want to thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I see from our participants list we've got some experienced growers and extension personnel on board here. So if you see questions pop up that you feel you can answer, feel free to jump in there and offer your opinions as well. As Christy said, I've been growing hops since 2011 over here. I'm based at the old quicksand station, now called the Robinson Center for Appalachian Resource Sustainability in eastern Kentucky. One of the reasons that this site was selected is because I have more disease pressure here in eastern Kentucky than at any of the other research farms that we have in our university system. We decided that if I could grow hops well here, then we should be able to grow them pretty well anywhere across eastern Kentucky. This was funded through part of a Specialty Crops block grant as well, but we have a lot of interest here in Kentucky, and I'd just like to jump on board here. I certainly can't answer all the questions initially, but I'll try to answer what I can. As I said, I'm learning about hops. I've found some things that I would like to do different myself already as we've gone, and I'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. If you do need to get a hold of me, the quickest way to reach me is actually by my email address, which is shown right there on the slide. It's just sean.wright@uky.edu. My cell phone number, I'll give it to you, but my cell phone connections here in eastern Kentucky are somewhat limited, but my cell phone number is 606-272-3500. That's 606-272-3500. My master's degree was from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville back in 1988, I guess I graduated, and I was actually in the botany department. I'm a frustrated botanist, I guess is some of the ways I like to think of myself. I don't know much about the brewing process, and I'll admit that up front, so if you wanted to learn a lot about brewing, we'll have some other webinars coming up probably in the future where you can learn more about that. But I'm a plant scientist. I grow plants, and hops are a plant. But as a old botanist, I thought it was good if we just at least recognize where some of our plants are coming from. Hops are in the order Rosales and the family Cannabinaceae. If you're at all familiar with some of our other crops in that family, you might recognize that that is also the family in which cannabis is located. Cannabis is an old crop here in Kentucky. Industrial hemp is really expanding now in eastern Kentucky, so we might have some plants from the same family soon that have significant commercial interest here in eastern Kentucky. There are 3 species within the genus Humulus, which is the genus for hops. One is Japonicus, which is an Asian hop from Eastern Asia. Yunanensis, the Yunnan hop from Southeast Asia, and Lupulus, which is the common hop. There's a lot of varieties within the species Lupulus, and it's all the different varieties within that species that are used for beer production that are grown commercially around the world. Some are more common to Europe, Western Asia. There is one, Lupuloides. It's also known as Americanus. It's a wild hops that grows here in eastern North America. We actually have some wild hops growing throughout this region and things as well. Don't produce anything suitable for brewing process to the best of my knowledge or anything else. But we're primarily talking about things that are coming from Europe and Western North America right now. I'm sure there's other hops breeding going on around the world. The craft beer industry is expanding everywhere, so there's a lot of interest in that, but I'm not a hops breeder. Hops are a perennial crop, and what that means is that they will regrow every year from overwintering structures called rhizomes. This is beneficial because unlike an annual crop that has to be planted every year, we plant them once, and a good hops planting could last probably anywhere from 15 to 20 years possibly. I think beyond that it would really be pushing it here in eastern Kentucky. Everybody has their own regions. I think one thing to consider with hops is always to be aware of what the interest is coming down the road. Be prepared for planting for future needs as well. But they do overwinter from structures called rhizomes. A rhizome is an underground stem that grows horizontally. So when you get your rhizomes to plant, you'll see that there are buds on the top surface, and the new shoots grow up from the nodes in the rhizome, and the roots grow down from those nodes. So you'll actually lay that out horizontally in your planting trench. This whole fact that they're perennials and regrow from rhizomes allows the plant to be propagated vegetatively, and this is very important because a hop plant is dioecious. Here you see a picture of a rhizome that we planted, and right there are some of the shoots coming off. On the underside there would be some roots growing down. We just planted those about 3 inches deep in the soil after we'd prepared our beds, and we saw emergence within 4 weeks or so back in 2011 when we planted them. We were very happy with them. One thing I did notice with the different varieties that we ordered was there were distinct differences in the size of the rhizomes. I think that had some bearing on the overwintering characteristics and just the overall growth of the hops here. I did have 5 varieties out here in eastern Kentucky. I was growing Cascade, Chinook, Mount Hood, Newport, and Nugget. I've since removed the Newport. They never really established well, but we'll talk more about varieties as we go on. Dioecious simply means that there's 2 houses. That means that there's a female hop plant and a male hop plant, and only the female plant produces the cones, which is the product that we're interested in for beer production or other purposes. If growers were going to be doing breeding in that, you actually need the male plants in order to get the cross-pollination so that you can extract the seeds, grow out the seeds, and do some breeding that way. I believe it's also possible there could be some breeders that are doing some tissue culture work, producing hops that way. I can't swear to that, but I know that is a much more rapid process than trying to breed traditionally through cross-pollination and things. In a hops yard or a hops planting, hops yard is typically the way we refer to them here. If for some reason a male plant did show up, we would want to remove that. The pollen in that can be produced can interfere with beer production and things, I've been told by the brewers and things. So if any male plants do show up, they're usually rogued out of the hops yards. And this is a shot of just some Cascade that I had growing out here a couple years ago in my planting. All these little structures in here are the various cones and things that are then harvested and used in the brewing process. Hops are mainly used for flavoring and stability agent in beer production. They can be used for various other purposes in other beverages and in herbal medicines. Talk a little bit about some of the alternative uses for hops and hop shoots. Hop shoots are actually edible, and that's something that I would like to see our growers here in Kentucky doing more, taking advantage of the market for hop shoots. I gave some hop shoots from my planting to our local family and consumer science agent. She grew them. Her husband really liked them. She wasn't as fond of them. Our SNAP Ed specialist here that I work with, she has grown some, or she didn't grow them, she cooked some that I grew, liked them very much. My family and I, we've cooked some up ourselves, and I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they both thought that they were very tasty as well. Simply braise them in a little bit of olive oil with a little bit of garlic and some chopped onion. They had a taste very similar to lightly steamed asparagus. I know that some people also pickle hop shoots. I've never tried that myself, but I know there's a market for those as well. One reason that I think the hop shoots sales is beneficial for our growers here in Kentucky, our hops will typically emerge sometime in early to mid-April depending upon the season. But my frost-free date is usually right around May 10th here in eastern Kentucky. So anything that grows from mid-April until my frost-free date, I just don't even bother concerning myself with trying to prune them out or anything else unless I was going to be selling them, because I know probably most years I'm going to get a frost sometime in that period, and the hops will freeze back to the ground here in eastern Kentucky if I get a good freeze, which is fairly typical. So there's no reason for me to spend the labor going through and removing anything that's germinating early, but our growers here that are doing that could actually come through, harvest those, and sell those. I have done a little bit of research, and I've seen places out west where hop shoots will sell for $30 to $35 per pound. You know, there's not a tremendous demand for them, but there certainly is a market for them. So that's something that I think our growers could do and take advantage of that market. You can also poach them, you can saute them, just different ways in which they can be cooked and things, and I found them good. But one of the key features to that is get them when they're short and small and tender. They do tend to get woody, and you want to make sure that you're selling the tender shoots. Hops also have sedative properties. It's related to the compound methylbutanol. And I want to thank Black Creek Hops up in Brighton, Michigan for this photo. They actually take their hops cones and they can sew them into these small sachets or pillows that are then placed next to people's bed pillows, because the sedative qualities from that are released, and it's used to help people sleep that have sleep disturbances, insomnia, and things like that. You can also make teas and things from the leaves. I need to point out that these uses aren't endorsed, nor have they been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration, but these are reported uses that seem to have some promise to them. Other reported uses include treatments for anxiety, tension, ADHD, used as an appetite stimulant, a diuretic, to stimulate the flow of breast milk, indigestion treatment, treating people with high cholesterol, treatment for TB, nerve pain and cancer treatments. Some of these things are related to a weak estrogen effect from some of the bioactive compounds in the plant itself. I know in Europe they've done much more use with some of these natural treatments for medical purposes and things, but strictly in terms of what the Food and Drug Administration has endorsed or recommended. It's the same disclaimer that you get from the various herbal supplements and things at the nutrition stores and things. They haven't been evaluated. These are things that have been reported. I will point out that according to the FDA's Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Volume 3, there's a whole citation for this there. They're considered one of the substances that are generally recognized as safe. That includes the essential oils and all that. So the FDA is not saying that they're harmful. They're generally recognized as safe, but they're not going to endorse the use of hops as a treatment for anxiety or for high cholesterol or for something like that. Growing hops is something that we're getting a lot of interest in, and most of the United States down to the southern Tennessee border and south, from southern Tennessee border north up into Canada, from 35 degrees to 55 degrees latitude. That's the region in which hops will grow well. They're long day plants. What that means is that the cones don't start forming, the reproductive flowers, the cones don't start forming until the night gets to a certain period of length. They need a short period of darkness in order to stimulate growth. And that's something to keep in mind just if you wanted to grow a few hops somewhere by your garage or in your backyard or something. If you have a security light or street lamps around, that could interfere with the flowering production of your hops potentially. So just be aware that they do need a short period of darkness, and if that darkness is interfered with, it can interfere with the flowering and things. They do have a chilling requirement. I'm not familiar with all the various chilling requirements for the different varieties, and generally what I have found is that it's about 1,000 hours under 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. If you were down in Mobile, Alabama, southern Florida, southern Texas, you probably would have difficulty growing hops well. I do know that some people have actually taken to chilling the rhizomes and plant them out to try and overcome of these things, but in terms of commercial production, really if you're north of Tennessee, southern border, you can probably grow hops well. They do prefer full sun, but they will tolerate moderate shade. Myself, you're going to get better growth in full sun. You're also going to have less problems with diseases in full sun because those plants will dry off, the leaves will dry off quicker. They prefer a medium moist to dry soil, but water is important at planting, so you should have the ability to irrigate these plants when you first plant your rhizomes. I have never had to irrigate my plants since we first planted them back in 2011. I get enough timely rains here that I haven't had to irrigate at all. I do have the ability to just drop a pump in the river though and have access to as much water as I need. But as I said, it hasn't become an issue for me yet. They do like a pH of around 5.7 up to 7.5. You know, you get much above 7 and they're not going to grow quite as well as they will between 6 and 7. Most of your plant nutrients are most available in a slightly acidic soil, which has a pH of 6 to 7. On the pH scale, which is a measure of acidity, from 0 to 7 is considered acid, with 0 being the most acidic, 7 is neutral, and 7 to 14 is alkaline, with 14 being the most alkaline. Most plants do actually grow best in a pH of 6 to 7 in terms of nutrient availability and things like that. Here in Kentucky, most of our growers, if they take soil samples into their county agents, a lot of the county agents will provide free soil testing in coordination with their farm and home nights or something like that. I know in other states, some land grant institutions have done away with their soil testing labs, so they need to be sent off to a commercial lab. But you'll get back an analysis that will tell you what the pH is of the soil and the general nutrient status of the plants from whatever soil testing lab that you use. And I always tell people that it's important to get your soil tested. As we say, don't guess, soil test, because we don't know what's in the soil until we actually have it analyzed. But I can guarantee that at least once every spring somebody's going to call up and ask, how much fertilizer should I put on my fields without having a soil test done? And I can't look at it and answer that question. So just make sure that if you're going to grow hops, get your soil tested every year. They do like a moderate fertility, roughly 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, about 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre. Potassium, I couldn't find good values that I felt comfortable listing for what the potassium requirements are for hops, but I didn't see them listed anywhere as being high potassium feeders. You also want to select your site properly. Avoid frost pockets. That would be a low-lying area where cold air could drain off of a hillside. If you look here, remember that cold air is heavier than is warm air. So in the springtime, even though it's warming up and the plants start to germinate, it doesn't mean that you can't get a cold night, and that cold air will settle in the low-lying areas. Likewise, if you have a hillside and you have a lot of conifers and things, those conifers or trees on the lower slope of the hill can act as a dam and trap the cold air higher up on the hillside. Here in eastern Kentucky, our warmest sites in the springtime are actually our ridgetops, which is why most of our commercial orchards are found on the ridgetops here in eastern Kentucky. Avoid areas with large nematode populations. We don't have a lot of nematode problems here in Kentucky, but Michigan State University does do nematode testing. There's an address there where you can contact them for more information on nematodes. See what's going on if you're concerned that you might have a nematode problem. It's always a good idea to do this due diligence up front to avoid any problems before you invest a lot of money into the trellis structures or into the plants themselves. For those of you that aren't familiar with nematodes, nematodes are small, unsegmented worms that can feed upon the roots of plants. There are also predaceous nematodes and things. Nematodes can also transmit disease and things. The root knot nematode is a nematode that some of our growers might be more familiar with, or the dagger nematode is another type of nematode that can attack plants as well. There is specifically a hop cyst nematode. The genus and species is listed there, but I don't personally know of anybody that's had any problems with nematodes, but that's not to say that it wouldn't be worth putting a few out. If you're going to make the investment in this enterprise for the future, I would certainly encourage you to just do some testing beforehand. Avoid areas that have been in sod in the previous years. Japanese beetles can be a very serious pest and are more common in recently sodded areas or areas where there is sod between your rows. The adult beetle comes along, she'll lay her eggs in the sod, and then the eggs will hatch, and you get the white grubs that you typically see in soils. One way that here in eastern Kentucky that you can tell is if you have a grub problem is the skunks will come along and tear up the sod looking to feed upon the white grubs and things. The Japanese beetle populations are cyclical. They do build up and then they crash. We don't have any real good treatments for controlling grubs in the soil. I would encourage people to think about what they're going to use between their rows on their hops. Grass is a possibility, but just be aware that if you do have the grass, there could potentially be more problems with Japanese beetles coming in. You could use a different type of cover crop possibly. I'm a beekeeper. Clover is a nice possibility for people to think about using as a cover crop between their rows. It'll give your plants some nitrogen. Be aware that clover can be somewhat invasive and can spread. Could be an issue to think about as well. So in any type of production system, there's no one perfect way for doing anything. And I just want to emphasize that to everybody. You've got to find what works well for you. Think about what's going to be best for what your goals are and things. I do, even though Japanese beetles can be a problem, I do have grass between my rows. It's a grass clover mixture, primarily because I have a lot of problems with Bermuda grass as a weed here, and it's just difficult to kill out. So I do have that, however. Avoid wet soils. That was one thing that I wish I had done more when I first planted hops myself. I wish I'd put them on a shallow raised bed. I'm not talking 1 foot or 2 foot high, just simply 3 to 4 inches would have been sufficient for my needs. Because as I worked out my planting area and things, I thought I was concerned about the hops drying out, and in order for me to irrigate, I have to drop a pump in the river and run lay flat hose and things. I don't have a hydrant that's readily accessible and things. So I didn't want to have to do that, so I was more concerned about the plants drying out. If you do put them on a raised bed, they're going to be more prone to drying out than if you don't have them on a raised bed. However, hops don't grow well in saturated soils, and I've had a few problems with root growth on my hops just because my soils tended to be a little bit heavier than I initially thought they would be. It's just one of those sites that I hadn't had any production on before, and learned as I've gone along that I would have preferred to have them on a raised bed. So now what I'm going to be doing is be working some organic matter into the areas where I'm not growing anything, build up an area there so that my plants, as I replant in those areas, will do better. This is a shot of some bed preparation. Brad Bergerford, I have the privilege of working with him at the Ohio State University South Centers in Piketon, just about 3 hours north of here, for almost a decade. And he has a nice hops planting established up there. And these photos are from some preparation that they were doing when they were first putting out their hops yard. You can see that they've gone through the white on the soil as lime. They've limed their soil. They've put down some fertilizer. They've tilled their soil. The soil up there tends to have a fair bit of clay in it. So you want to make sure, no matter whether you're in hops production or any type of garden production, that you don't work your soils when they're wet, because you can destroy the structure of the soils and break them down that way. So never work your soils when they're wet. But they allowed their soils to dry out. They went through and disked them, tilled them, and then they went through, that's an old Reddick fumigant bedder, puts up a nice sized bed right there. And then in the picture in the lower right hand corner, you can see they actually laid landscape fabric down in their hops yard. I don't use landscape fabric for weed control in mine. We'll talk a little bit more about weed control as we go on. I know that they've been very happy with how that has worked for them up to this point. But that's what I'm talking about, putting up a raised bed. It's always easier to put up a raised bed before you plant in anything rather than to try and come through and put it up once your plants are there and you have to tear out plants, or as plants die out in a section, to put it in, build it up that way. So spend extra time initially from the front preparing your site. Trellising is required. That's one of the most expensive parts of the whole system. Hops can easily grow 25 feet tall in a season. I like to tell people they're just very long weeds that grow very well. I've never had a lot of problems growing hops, getting good growth. Mine usually will reach my top wire without any difficulty at all. Here's a shot of my hops yard back from 2011 when we were first laying things out. Those poles, we cut them. We have the Robinson Forest as part of the University of Kentucky. We had a sawmill there at one point, and they cut those poles for me from some timber that they had down at the forest. We used those and put those on site here. Gives you a little bit idea about the topography where I'm located. As you can see, I'm in the hills of eastern Kentucky. It tends to be low-lying. Just to the left of the pecan orchard in the back is the North Fork of the Kentucky River, passes right along Highway 15. So I'm on an elevated river bottom, so the whole surrounding area is higher. Cold air will settle down in this site where I'm located. This is a shot of Brad's hop yard at the OSU Piketon and Research Extension Center. Brad and Tom Harker do the work up there. He's got a larger hops planting with more varieties growing up there than I've got growing down here. I'd encourage anybody that's in that general area to take advantage of visiting that site as well. This is a shot from the Revolutionary Hop Farm over in Carter County. Scott Eidson is one of the growers over there. We had the privilege of going out and visiting his farm last year, doing a site visit. As you can see from the 3 previous slides, different types of poles can be used. We cut our own poles. Brad used old phone poles. Scott is using pine logs that he's harvested from his own site there that have been charred and placed in the ground. There's no one perfect way. Growers need to do what works best for them. Think about what your long-term goals are. If you have unlimited funds and things, certainly buy the best you can, but this just shows that you don't have to go out and use telephone poles or anything like that. You can use whatever you have available. One of the key features of all those, however, is they need to be tall. If they're not tall, you're going to limit the growth and the production of your hops plants. Hops are not vines. People will often talk about a hops vine, but they're actually a vine. They grow clockwise around the trellis by means of stout hairs. A vine with a V actually has suckers or tendrils that will reach out and attach themselves to the structure that they're growing upon. Vines don't. It's simply the stout hairs that help them grab whatever they're climbing up. Hops vines will actually climb around each other to a certain point, though they're not particularly stout, and they're not going to reach 25 tall without having some type of trellis string to grow up upon. Just one of those facts that I like to mention as an old botanist. There are dwarf hops. They typically grow 10 to 15 feet tall in a season. I don't have any dwarf hops growing here. The availability of dwarf hops is somewhat limited. I think if we can get more dwarf hops production going, it would be beneficial, assuming that we can get the varieties that the brewmasters are interested in using for their brews and things. Because if you can get by with a shorter trellis, it makes your picking and harvesting much easier. It also just limits the expenses you have, because a 15 or 20 foot pole is going to cost significantly less than a 25 or 30 foot pole. Here's a link for the American Dwarf Hop Association, located out in Washington, some contact information for them. They have a very nice website and things as well. I think they're doing some interesting work, and hopefully we can partner with them in the future and get some more dwarf hops, at least as a demonstration here in the East. Most hops are trained on tall trellises, roughly 18 to 20 feet to maximize yields. The trellis is an engineered structure subject to substantial loads, including the plant. Figure roughly a hops plant. The vines will grow up from the crown, get about 35 pounds per crown. You can also get a lot of wind stress growing on that. A 60-mile-an-hour wind is equivalent to about 10 pounds per square foot of weight on your trellis system. So you can see how quickly weight and stresses will build up on your trellis system, which is why you need to think about a stout trellising system when you put things in. We'll take a look at the trellis system. There's no perfect method for trellising.
We've lost audio, Sean. Sean?
Oh, he's off. He's off.
Well, we'll try to get Sean back into his presentation. He's obviously having some technical difficulties, so bear with us. Let's see. There he is. All right, we should have Sean back now.
Okay, I am back. Apologize for that. Technology is great, except when it doesn't work. When I started out with my hops planting, I actually had high tensile wire for my top wire, but after using that system for a couple years, I switched, and last year I replaced all my high tensile wire with coated aircraft cable for the top wire. And this was one of my research assistants. The first year we put the system up, he's just attaching the high tensile wire up there. But this is what I've switched to. Scott Eitzen was actually the one that talked to me about this and convinced me that it worked out well. I simply run my aircraft cable up along the post, have it wound around a boat winch there, and that way, what I like about using the aircraft cable is hops are labor intensive and I have limited labor source, and when we had them connected to the high tensile wire, it always took 3 or 4 of us to harvest them. Somebody to run the tractor, a couple of people on the harvest platform as we were raised up to cut the bines down and all that. By switching to the aircraft cable that I can just lower with the boat winch, I can harvest them myself simply by lowering the top wire down. It's working well so far. There's a few things that I'd like to modify still as we go along, learning different ways that work, what doesn't work and things, but I like this system myself strictly as a labor-saving device. Our poles are set 3.5 to 4 feet deep in the ground and are spaced 30 to 60 feet apart. We have earth anchors that help to support the poles and a bottom catch wire along with miscellaneous hardware, cable ties and various things. A typical planting scheme is 7 by 7 foot or 3.5 foot by 10 with an average of 800 to 1,000 plants per acre. I actually have my plants on 4-foot spacing with about 15 feet between rows. For me, it's very important that I get as much airflow through my planting as possible. As I said, we're very humid here in eastern Kentucky. We have a lot of disease pressure, so the more airflow I can get through my hops planting, the better off I'm going to be. This is just a shot of one of those earth anchors with some high tensile wire coming down. Also need to point out just right here is some flagging tape that we put on our high tensile wire to make sure that when the crew is mowing around the hops planting, they don't catch their necks on the high tensile wire leading from the poles to the anchors and things. We'll talk a little bit about what and when is involved in growing hops. This is Dr. Tim Woods. He's an ag economist with the University of Kentucky. He put it very succinctly at a meeting I was at about a year ago, something that we've been trying to simplify and explain to growers for as long as I've been with Extension. But he said that you need to put in a production system to support your marketing system. If you're just growing hops as a hobby, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you're happy with your end results. But if you're thinking about putting in a commercial enterprise that you're going to be investing your time and resources into, you need to put in a production system that supports your marketing system. I worked at Iowa State University. I visited the Field of Dreams, and I know that just because you build something doesn't mean that the market is going to show up. You need to do due diligence before you put the first plant in the ground. Figure out where you're going to market your hops, how you're going to market them, what people are looking for in terms of varieties, when they're going to want them and things. Because you can grow all the hops that you want, but there's no money to be made in growing hops. There's only money to be made in when you sell them, like any other agricultural crop. You can grow all you want, but if you don't sell it, you don't make any money. Variety selection is important. In our list of resources, there is a link to variety selection guide at usahops.org. Has descriptions about all the different varieties that are out there, growth characteristics, acid profiles, and things like that. As I said, I'm not a brewing expert by any means. Some of our brewmasters and that can answer those questions much better. But that's one thing that I always encourage people to do, is talk to whoever's going to be purchasing your hops. Find out what they want, because if you're put in a high alpha acid type or something and they want something that has low alpha acids, you're not going to have a market for them. So it's better to find out what people want you to grow before you put them in the ground. Also, if you could forward contract that, if you could get some of the purchasers of your end product, your hops cones, to help finance the initial planting with the understanding that you will guarantee them a certain amount in the future at a lower than market price, they might be willing to help forward pay some of those production costs for anybody that's going to be growing hops. This is just what that variety manual looks like. Variety selection, there are bittering types, there's aroma types, there's what are called noble hops. There's some that have dual characteristics of bittering and aroma types, and let's talk about that a little bit now. Bitterness in beer comes from the alpha acid in the hops that's added during the boil. These are hops that are added early in the brewing process, and they contribute little to the aroma and the flavor, because those compounds that you would sense through the smell and the taste are boiled off. But the bitterness that is added to offset the sweetness from the malt and things in the hops, or in the barley, that's where the hops, the bittering comes in early in the process. Those are bittering types. Here in Kentucky, we can certainly grow bittering types, but my own personal gut feeling is that there's not that much demand for a lot of bittering types of hops here in Kentucky. Most of our commercial hops production in the United States is out west in Washington, Idaho, Oregon, those regions. They can grow them much easier than we can. It's not an easy process anytime you're involved in agricultural production, but they don't have the disease pressure out there that we have to deal with here in the eastern United States. That's what led to the downfall of the hops industry back in the early 1900s, was disease problems, which is why it moved west. So let the western growers grow all these bittering types is kind of my gut level feeling if somebody wanted my general input. I mean, if you have a brewery that's willing to help you grow bittering hops and they're willing to purchase them from you, certainly put it in. Grow whatever the market will buy from you. But for myself, the people that I've talked to that are involved in brewing, they say that they can get all the bittering types they want out of the West cheaper than our growers here could probably grow them. Aroma types hops add flavor and aroma to beer, and that comes from the beta acid in the hops. And these are added late in the brewing process after the initial boil and things. So these give them their characteristic citrusy scent or floral scent, different types of aromas and things that people pick up in the beers and things. They come from the beta acids in the hops. Noble hops specifically come from Europe. They have a 1-to-1 roughly ratio of alpha and beta acids, whereas most other hops have about a 2-to-1 ratio of alpha to beta acids. And there's the 4 most common noble type of hops that are available out there. I don't know anybody personally that's growing any of those varieties myself. Site preparation should always begin at least 1 year prior to planting, but this is after you've already determined what your marketing strategy is going to be, what your varieties are going to be. Then you start on the site preparation. Make sure that you get weeds under control, particularly your perennial weeds that are going to be difficult to control. Get your soil tested so that you can add any lime or fertilizers to the soil before you begin. Put up a raised bed if you think that your soils are going to need one. Put in your trellis system, an irrigation system. All those are important things to get established before you put the first rhizome in the ground. In the planting year, when your soils have warmed approximately 3 weeks before your frost-free date, so our planting date here would be last week in April, first week in May for a mid-May frost-free date. By that point, our soils at 4 inches deep are probably at about 50 degrees, which is good enough. In your planting year, you're going to have to think about irrigation and pest control. In your production year, in your planting year, it's possible that you will get enough growth on them that you'll want to have the ability to string your trellis wires from your bottom catch wire up to your top wire. You may not get that much growth. Myself, we did string ours, but we could have just let ours grow along the ground that first year because they didn't put on enough growth that we were worried about any cone production that year, and it would have saved in a lot of time and effort of just stringing our baling twine from the bottom catch wire to the top catch wire. I guess I didn't mention earlier, what I use between my top wire and my bottom wire is simple baling twine. I know some growers will use heavier types of twine, coconut fiber, core type fiber, and things like that. I've never had any problem with my trellis wires or my twine from the bottom catch wire to the top wire breaking during a growing season, even when we get some heavy winds and things. I think I get my growth because my assistant's been out stringing hops now, getting ready. We've cut off all of our new shoots. We'd actually harvested some of the shoots for eating for edible purposes. We've cut them off now, and anything that comes up this first year, or not this first year, but this production year, we're actually going to string them up. We'll select 4 binds per crown, and we'll run 2 binds up one wire and 2 binds up another wire from the bottom to the top in basically a V shape. So that's something that's done every year after that first year that you plant your rhizomes. Trellis them. There's also the labor involved in removing additional shoots because the crown is going to want to put out additional shoots all season long, at least until probably late July, early August here in eastern Kentucky. And so we need to come through and we'll cut off any additional binds that come off of that crown other than the 4 that we have running up our baling twine from the bottom wire to the top wire. Some growers will actually do leaf stripping as well to help control diseases. They'll remove leaves from about the bottom 3 to 4 feet of their hops binds. I don't do that myself. I haven't seen that it would be that beneficial to me. Other people might think that it's beneficial to them. It's just a matter of personal preference. I think you find out what works best for what you're growing in your situation, what works best for the varieties that you're growing, and do that. But again, that's additional labor that would be involved in hops production. Irrigation and pest control are something that's ongoing every year in production and harvesting as well. This shows them stringing the hops at OSU. They have a nice OSHA approved platform for doing that. This was us getting harvesting actually our planting year in 2011. I did have a couple there that we strung up just temporarily to see what was looking like, but that was the platform that we had for harvesting that first year. Once you harvest your hops, you need to dry them down unless you're going to be selling them to a brewery that's using them in a fresh hops brew. If they're using them in a fresh hops brew, I've been told by the brewmasters that they like to get them off the vine and into the kettle within 24 hours. So that's a real quick turnaround. If you do dry them down, they usually come off at about 75% moisture, and you try and get them down to 8.5% moisture within a day. This is just a homemade drying Oast that the crew built for their drying up at Ohio State University, using basically a box fan and some screen, some wood, and they said that it works very well for their purposes up there. I have some drying racks myself, but I don't have a fan attached to mine. I get good airflow through mine that I can just spread mine out and put them in one of our barns, and they dry out quick enough for me. Pest management is something I want to talk about as well. Remember that the label is the law. Just because you've read somewhere on the internet that you can use some compound for treating some pests doesn't mean that it's legal. If the crop and pest aren't on the label, you can't use it. Also, I need to point out, particularly here in Kentucky for our Kentucky growers, that just because it's labeled for use in another state doesn't mean that it's labeled in Kentucky. There's a federal label, but there are compounds that are labeled for use out west that we don't have labeled for use here in Kentucky. The companies don't feel they'll sell enough product that it justifies the cost of getting the product labeled for use here in Kentucky. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're going to be growing hops is what you're going to be using for pest management. Also think in mind, is the brewmaster going to want hops that have been sprayed or not? There's a lot of push towards sustainable production or low input production. So certainly the less spraying that you're doing, not only will it be perceived as being more healthful or better for the environment, it also costs less for the grower, because every time you have to hook up the tractor and go through the field and spray, that's costing you fuel, it's costing you chemical, and it's costing you time. So kind of keep in mind what you're going to be using for your pest management practices. Disease management with all agricultural production, I always try to stress the use of resistant cultivars, getting plants through the clean plant network. Sanitation, if you do have disease in your planting, make sure you get in and treat it. Don't leave diseased plants in there all winter long. Clean up at the end of the season. Drip irrigation is much more beneficial than trying to come in and spray the plants, because drip irrigation puts the water right at the base of the plant so the leaves aren't getting wet, which will cut down on the amount of diseases and things that you're getting as well. Downy mildew is a problem in eastern Kentucky. This is one of the main reasons why hops production moved west. It likes wet conditions. It likes moderate temperatures, 60 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see you will actually get kind of a blocky lines here in the leaves that are limited by the veins in the leaf. Need at least 4 to 8 hours of leaf wetness for leaf and shoot infection, and the spores can survive in infected buds and crown, which is important, why your sanitation is important at the end of the season. It is angular, as I pointed out, limited by leaf veins. They kind of get chlorotic, kind of pale green on the edge of the foliage. Purplish gray or black spores may appear on the bottom of the leaf. But in order to see that, you need to get out when the humidity is high, because by mid-morning, when the humidity levels have dropped, any spores on the backside of the leaf have typically dried up by that point, and you won't see them. You will see occasionally what are called spikes. They have little short internodes and appear chlorotic. that's a symptom of downy mildew as well. There are fungicides that are available. Before applying any disease or pest management product, make sure you read the label to be sure that the product is allowed for the crop and the problem you intend to manage, and read and understand the label. Make sure you have your personal protective equipment that you're wearing for your own health and safety. Copper products can be very good. Metalaxyl is a possibility. Some of the phosphorus acid products also can be used for downy mildew. For growers that are trying to use more of a biorational approach, streptomyces, there's actinovate is one variety, or there's a bacillus, a bacteria sold as Sonata that you can use. There's a biochemical biopesticide, it's an extract sold as Regalia. Potassium bicarbonate sold as Ecomate that can also be used. And there's a link there for some information on biorational products as well. Powdery mildew is another type of mildew that the hops can get. They can overwinter in crop debris, soil, infected buds. It's favored by rapid plant growth, high humidity, and cloudy weather. That's one reason that I try to limit somewhat any additional nitrogen fertilizers I put on my hops. I don't want them growing too rapidly because they'll be more prone to diseases as well. This is what powdery mildew looks like. It's very obvious. Looks like white powdery colonies all over the surface of the leaf, and that's going to really impact the growth of the plant. Again, copper products are available for use. Some phosphorus acid products are available for use, and the biorational products. Neem oil was one that is listed as having some capabilities for treating powdery mildew as well. Verticillium wilt is a common fungus in soil. It affects numerous types of woody and herbaceous plants. If anybody's involved in vegetable production or small fruit production, I'm sure you're familiar with that. It can infect the plants through their roots. Really does well in wet soils, which if you have a raised bed, this is going to help cut down on the amount of verticillium wilt that you're going to have with your plants. The leaves of an infected plant turn yellow and they wilt from the base on upward. This is what a shot of verticillium wilt looks like. Once it's in the soil, unfortunately, it's very difficult to treat. Years ago, we used to be able to fumigate our soils, and that did a great job at controlling many of the diseases and nematodes and weed problems, but that's no longer an option for us anymore. In terms of insects, spider mites are probably the most common insect that people need to be concerned about. They're very tiny. You can just see them on the back of the leaf here and here. They're pale yellow to reddish. They may have a dark spot on each side of the insect. They're really a problem during dry, warm weather. If it's moist or if it's cooler, spider mites tend not to be as much of a problem. If you include red clover into a ground cover mix, they tend to host predatory mites that help to control spider mites as well. Japanese beetles are a sporadic pest. The problem with Japanese beetles, amongst the damage that they do to the plant itself, is the insecticides that are used to control Japanese beetles will often cause the spider mite populations to flare up. So even if you control your Japanese beetles, you're then setting yourself up for dealing with a spider mite problem. This is what Japanese beetles did to my planting here in 2012. Not much left of those leaves, so you can see that it would be difficult to get any decent production off of those plants. Weed management, there's different strategies for weed management. Cultivation is one of my favorite means for weed control. Brad, as I said, is using the landscape fabric at Ohio State. They like that. They've been very happy with it. Herbicides, Volunteer is something that's labeled. It's clethodim. It's grass herbicide. Works well for controlling grasses and things. So, but me, I'm partial to cultivation. I think that works very well myself. In terms of recommended resources here in Kentucky, I always encourage people to contact their local county agent first. If they have any questions, the county agents know how to get a hold of me, or if they're more of a livestock agent and they're uncomfortable with horticultural production, I can come out and work with the growers and work with the agents to help us all get educated. I encourage people to check into like the Kentucky Hops Growers Alliance. They have a Facebook page and a listserv. They're very active. They're doing a lot of very good things here in Kentucky. The Kentucky Guild of Brewers is also active on Facebook. Our Kentucky Department of Ag is where we would check here in Kentucky to see if our pesticides are labeled for use on hops. Unfortunately, they don't really have a searchable database where you can put in hops as a crop and see everything that's labeled. You have to know the product that you're looking for and then check to see if it's listed. I do have that information available for our agents or our growers if they want that, things that I have found. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole database, but I do have a listing of various miticides and things that are labeled for use here in Kentucky. USAHops.org, blog.47hops is one that I really like their stuff. I read their blog quite often for good information on what's going on in the hops world. I encourage anybody here in Kentucky or in the surrounding region across the Midwest to check out our Center for Crop Diversification. The hops profile is listed there. There's an Ohio Hops Growers Guild. Our Ohio Hops Growers Alliance is now registered with the Kentucky Department of State. I forget offhand what the official type of structure is off the top of my head, but they are now listed as well with the Kentucky Department of State. They've got their paperwork filed as well. In terms of a field guide for IPM and hops, the USDA has one out there. Sustainable Hops Production in the Great Lakes region is a nice PDF bulletin put out by Michigan State. North Carolina State University has done a lot of work with hops production as well. I encourage people that are more towards the southern region to check out what they're doing there in North Carolina. Brad is going to be having a Southwest Ohio Hop Farm and Craft Brewery bus tour, and you can contact Brad at burgerford.1@osu.edu, or there's the website as well. I'm sure he'd love to have people on his tour as well. They're doing a monthly hop yard tour at North Carolina State University at their Mountain Research Station. Dr. Davis would love to have people down there with that. And I need to put in a plug for our own Dr. Seth DeBolt in the Department of Horticulture here at the University of Kentucky. Just on the 4th of this month, just a couple of days ago, a new undergraduate certificate in distillation, wine, and brewing studies was approved by the faculty senate and things. So they're hoping to provide this certificate to people that are interested in obtaining that certificate studies. The brewing, distilling, and winemaking industry here in Kentucky is doing very well, even though we do have a lot of dry counties in Kentucky where alcohol is not sold. We do have our bourbon industry and our craft brewing industry and our wine industry, and we're hoping that by the participants in this certificate program going through that process, they're working with the industry as they develop this program, and so they know what the industry is looking like. The students will have that background in chemistry and horticulture and everything else so that they can be plugged into the industry here in Kentucky or in other regions as well. For more information on that program, I'd encourage people to contact Dr. Seth DeBolt about that program. That's what I had. There's my email and my office phone number. If people would really like to contact me, feel free. I'll try and answer some questions here at the end from people that have them. Want to thank everybody for joining on board here and apologize for the technical glitch. And thanks to Christy and Miranda up there in Lexington for getting us organized and allowing us to do this remotely from here and everything. So at that point, I guess I'll take some questions.
All right, we've had several questions that have come in during the presentation. Please feel free to go ahead and type in any other questions you might have, and we'll spend some time answering those. The first, Sean, there was a little discussion going on about this among the participants, but Suzanne Stumbo was wondering how hops grow horizontally, and just wanted to check and see what your opinion is on that.
Okay, well, I guess I wasn't clear there. When I meant that hops grow horizontally, the stem grows horizontally under the ground. The rhizome itself grows horizontally, but the shoots grow vertically up your twine from your bottom catch wire to your top wire. A rhizome, it's just like other, you have various perenniating underground structures, whether it's a tuber, a rhizome, or a stolon, and all those are different types of structures. But rhizome is an underground stem that grows horizontally. Apologize for the confusion there.
Well, we had some indications people have seen them actually grown successfully, actually the vines horizontally, but you don't get nearly as much production per acre doing it that way.
No, that if somebody wanted to just grow them along the fence for something pretty to look at, you could do that, but the plants are going to want to grow horizontally or vertically as long as they've got something to climb up. If they don't have anything to climb up, they'll just lay on the ground. They will twist around themselves, and I've seen them get up to about 3 foot tall or so before they flop over, at least in my planting here.
All right. We had another question is, what is the reason for removing leaves at the bottom of the plant?
That is done to prevent any spread of disease. As we talked about, the spores from the mildews can be present in the soil. The diseases will progress up the stem from the soil up the plant, and if you remove any diseased lower leaves and things, that slows down the development of the disease up the plant itself. It also increases the airflow through the trellis system. I don't do that. I have my plants on a wider spacing because for me it was easier to plant the plants on a wider spacing than it would be to go through and strip leaves. A lot of that's just a personal decision. If you have a lot of available labor, it's kind of like the vinifera grape growers. They'll actually go through and pull leaves off to help grape clusters ripen up on some varieties and things. Some won't, but that whole process of getting airflow through and allowing things to grow better. But myself, when I've looked at the labor involved in removing leaves and things, it just doesn't make sense economically to me in terms of the labor involved.
All right, we have a question about pest control, saying 7 kills Japanese beetles but causes mites to build up, but malathion kills both. So can it be used on hops?
I'll have to check the label on that to make sure. I've got my list of approved miticides, but I don't dare go to that file right now since my computer crashed earlier in the presentation. But I'll get the contact information from the person that has the question and answer that question just as soon as I have a chance to check my list.
That was from Mike Clare. So.
Okay, I'll get a hold of you, Mike.
Another question from Robbie Smith. Where do you purchase rhizomes?
There's a number of sources online that you can go through. Use your favorite search engine and check them out. Some of our hops growers here in Kentucky are actually selling rhizomes as well, because these rhizomes are going to continue to grow and spread as the plants age. And sometimes the growers will need to go through and cut back some of those rhizomes just to keep them from spreading and crowding themselves out in the planting itself. So sometimes you can buy rhizomes directly from growers that are currently growing currently growing hops as well.
Okay. Is there a good resource for obtaining trellis equipment, such as poles?
That's really going to be an economic decision. Whatever's closest to the grower. The poles are going to be the most expensive thing because they're the largest thing and going to cost you money for shipping and things. The cable wires, high tensile wire, that sort of thing is available in numerous places, but the poles themselves can be your biggest expense. Growers would need to check with their county agent or possibly check with some of the utility programs, electrical companies and things in their area to see where they would recommend purchasing them.
Okay.
We do have somebody here that was actually looking at getting into production of cedar poles themselves. He's kind of more over in central Kentucky because we have a lot of eastern red cedar that grows wild here in Kentucky. They were actually going to be harvesting the red cedar and selling it that way. So that would be another opportunity as well. Check with forestry specialists in your area, see if they know anybody that's growing red cedar, things like that. That should give you some poles that are tall enough. Black locust probably wouldn't give you long enough straight poles to use, but cedar should.
Okay. What is the reason for only letting 2 binds per string?
There's a couple reasons for that. The ones that start growing later in the season aren't going to get enough growth on them to produce significant quality of or quantity of cones, so they'll be competing with the existing cone production that's already going on the plant. Also, the more leaf area you have, the more potential you have for diseases because you're getting less airflow through there. Here in eastern Kentucky, my big concern is really keeping healthy plants. Certainly we've got to have cone production, or I would if I could actually sell my cones and things. I don't sell my cones, but if I was interested in commercial production, you've got to have cone production, but you've got to have healthy plants in order to produce quality cones. And I'm always more interested in getting good airflow through my canopy and things to help cut down on disease issues, because some of these diseases can actually show up on the cones as well, not just on the leaves and the binds themselves.
All right. Is there a local or regional co-op for processing hops into pellets or freezing or drying them?
Not that I'm aware of. I know Ohio State University, their Hops Growers Guild, they're looking at getting some commercial harvesters, I believe, in the future. Ohio has a lot more acreage than Kentucky does. Currently, we're somewhere between 20 and 30 acres is the best estimate I have for all hops production in the state of Kentucky, with probably 15 acres geared towards commercial production and the other 15 towards hobbyists and people that just have a couple of binds and things going. It's not a big expense to produce those drying racks, depending upon how much production you're getting involved in. I would certainly encourage people to start out small because the labor requirements involved in hops can be substantial. Certainly, unless you have a lot of money to invest, I would go no larger than a quarter acre to half an acre. Half an acre would be a substantial commitment the first year out for somebody. Just as kind of a rule of thumb, I had somebody that was looking at putting in 5 acres of hops this year, and that would have made them our largest hops producer in the state of Kentucky.
Okay. In regards to soil moisture, will drainage tile with raised beds and a silt loam soil be enough to remove excess water?
Oh, it should be. Probably just a raised bed alone would be sufficient. The drainage tile isn't going to hurt any, but it's just an additional expense to the cost of production.
Okay. Another question here. What do you recommend for IPM for organic farm production?
That can be a challenge. Some of the biorational pesticides that I mentioned in the talk would be the options. In terms of weed control, cultivation is going to be your main method of weed control. That's one of our challenges. There's fewer pesticides that are labeled for organic production than for conventional production. Not saying that they can't be effective, but they're often more expensive as well, so people need to think about the cost of production. And that's where the sanitation for disease management would be critical. Removing any diseased plants at the end of the season. Leaf stripping would probably be beneficial in a situation like that. Use of disease-resistant cultivars. In terms of insect management, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that can be used for treating Japanese beetles. The Japanese beetle traps have been found to attract more beetles than they'll actually kill, so you're just bringing in problems when you use those. I guess you could always use them as a trap and put them far away from your hops planting, preferably on a neighbor's yard or somewhere where they're drawn away from your planting. But that would be one of those things that, as a strict scientific analysis, I can't say that it would be cost effective or actually functional. Mites are really going to be a problem in a hot, dry year. If it is getting hot and dry, you could think about spraying your plants down with some water, because that will dislodge a lot of the hops or dislodge a lot of the mites off the hops. That would be a possibility, but then you would want to make sure you're doing it early enough in the day that the leaves do dry off to cut down on disease problems.
Okay. Another question here, is there any profit in planting a half acre of hops? If so, how much money can you make selling to a brewery?
That's a very good question, and that's very site specific. If you have a microbrewery or a craft brewery that's in your neighborhood or in the general region where you live that's interested in producing a locally produced product, there's certainly the potential for profit there, because here in Kentucky we have our Kentucky Proud certification, we have our Appalachian Proud certification. Now they've gone with the Homegrown by Heroes certification. All these marketing strategies will help to increase the value of the hops when you sell them to the brewery. But you need to make sure that the varieties that you have are varieties that the brewmaster wants to use in their hops production. I knew somebody that was growing hops here in Kentucky that had about 2 acres and ended up pulling them all out simply because the varieties that they were producing weren't the ones that were necessarily in high demand by the breweries. Also, there was problems with coordination between when the hops were going to be available and when the brewmaster was going to have vats available. That's why I always encourage people to start out initially. If you're interested in commercial production of hops, the first thing you need to do is contact any breweries that you think you might be selling to and say, what variety of hops do you use? Are you interested in producing or purchasing from a local producer? What would you be willing to pay for locally produced versus what you can source dried from Idaho or from a hops broker out west or something like that? And then once you sit down with those numbers, then you can start penciling out whether there's actually a market. But you can't think just strictly about the market for the cones themselves, but you also need to be thinking about selling the hop shoots as an edible product at the farmer's market or to high-end restaurants. People are always interested in unique foods. There's also the possible market for making the little pillows or sachets that you could sell to people at the farmer's market as even if people aren't having trouble sleeping. I like the aroma of hops myself. I find it a very pleasant aroma. I mean, as a rough guideline for hops production here in Kentucky, Southern Ohio, Indiana, that general area, I think you could be looking at anywhere from 500 pounds to a couple thousand pounds per acre once you have a mature planting. But again, some of that is going to be dependent upon the variety. And I don't know if I emphasize this enough, but when you select your varieties, you don't select them based on yield. Just because you can produce a lot of something doesn't mean somebody's going to want to buy a lot of something. You need to select your varieties based upon what the end purchaser wants. So if they want Mount Hood, even though Mount Hood produces significantly less than Cascade for me, I would grow Mount Hood before I would grow Cascade because I know that's what they want, and I'd put in a little Cascade as just an extra, even though my yields for Cascade could be 2 or 3 times what my yields for Mount Hood would be. You always need to be thinking about who's going to be growing them, because there is no money made in growing anything. The money is made when you sell it.
We have a comment here from one of our horticulture agents that NC State has enterprise budgets for small-scale hops. We'll see if we can find a URL for that to provide you. And Michigan State has an estimated cost to production. It may help after figuring out a buyer and potential prices. If anyone else, here we go, we've got the NC State enterprise budget up there. Anybody who wants to take a look at that, that should be a really useful tool. Thank you, Adam. And if we've got any more questions, we'll take just 1 or 2 more. And I would like to again point you to the files pod at the lower left-hand side of your screen. The handout from the presentation is there, and that Hops 101 resource list, that will give you all those links that Sean referred to in his presentation. And again, it would really help us out if you could take just a couple of minutes to do the follow-up survey. The URL is there on the screen. This will help us in planning future programming and see how we can better serve you. So with that, looks like we might have one more question coming in. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and that's not a question, it's a thank you, and you're very welcome. And thanks to Sean for his work on this presentation, and we appreciate your interest. I'll leave the meeting room open for a few minutes if you haven't had a chance to take the survey or access any of those documents you'd like to download. We appreciate your being with us today, and good luck to you. And whether you try to grow hops or not, we'll be around. If you need more information, always you're welcome to contact the Center for Crop Diversification, and we'll help you in any way we can. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to contact me if you have other questions, and I'll try and help you out. I'll get that answer to you, Mike.